So welcome everyone. So this is a kind of a hybrid, event, and it's a webinar for Thanatic ethics, and at the same time, it is one of Emma seminar, one of the Tuesday, seminars. So before I introduce our guest speakers and also my co-chair, who is sitting right opposite me, so I would like to welcome you back to Thanatic Ethics in Montpellier. It is indeed the third time that we are organizing an event related to Thanatic Ethics in Montpellier. So the first time in person was immediately after the COVID in September 2021. Yumnan and Marwan, you were among us. The recorded event can actually be found entirely on the website, thanaticethics.com. At the time, there was Wanjiru Kamuyu, who was our guest, choreographer. And the second time was in December 2021, where our guest choreographer was Arkady Zaides, and the more specific event focused on the artist, activist, and choreographer. So our guest speakers here were also with us during the first international conference that happened at Oxford, and Thomas Lacroix, I can see him, he's online. So that first conference happened at the Maison Française at Oxford in April 2022, which was also recorded and which you can also find online. This is the moment where we met Sid and Catriona in Oxford. And thanks to Yumna and thanks to some of the connections, in fact, that happened in the network, in Thanatic Ethics network, there was also an internship that was organized, with your students in X. So maybe we can, say something about this later on. And so I would now like to introduce, our two guest speakers. So Sid Bolton, who is, as you could see on the presentation, is a children's human rights lawyer, non-practising, but former, legal and policy officer, including for Coram Children's Legal Center and the Children's Legal Center, Medical Foundation for the Care of Victims of Torture, Islington Law Center, Wilfred Monroe Solicitors, and he has, spoken and delivered, training on the rights of children, in particular, refugee, asylum seeking, and also migrant children, nationally and also internationally. And he's been an advisor to the Children's Commissioner, England. Catriona Jarvis is a former judge of the United Kingdom Upper Tribunal, so Immigration and Asylum Chamber, former children's lawyer and former teacher. And she has worked as well on refugee rights, especially concerning women and children. And she's chair of the board of Mytilini, co-convener of the Equal Justice for Migrant Children project of First Rights, and co-convener of Last Rights, both programs of Mytilini, and you will know everything that that needs to be known about the last rights, because this is also what your presentation is about. So thank you so much for being here, and of course there will be a discussion afterwards. So floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. And first of all, we want to say thank you especially to Professor Mizrahi Barak and all her colleagues at Emma, at the University Paul Valéry here in Montpellier, for inviting us to speak and for hosting and facilitating this seminar and webinar today. We also want to thank Professor Masawa from the American College of the Mediterranean, who will be co-chairing and contributing to the discussion that we will have, I hope, after we've spoken a little. And indeed, as Judith said, to everybody who's involved in the Thanatic ethics program. Thank you in particular to everybody who has taken their time to attend and to give their time virtually to listening to us and taking part in what I hope will be a stimulating discussion. In terms of the seminar or webinar itself, I feel a little bit torn in two, facing yourselves in the room and the camera on the wall. So I hope that I can be forgiven for maybe not addressing you or appearing to address you directly if my head is turned the wrong way. I'll begin by speaking, followed by Catriona. We'll speak, I think, for probably about 40 minutes to give enough time to develop a conversation. And I look forward to your comments and questions. So to begin with, by way of a short background, and Catriona will expand on that in a little while. We're the founders of and directors of a small and relatively new non-government organisation. We're a registered charity in the United Kingdom. And whilst you can see the banner refers to the Last Rights Project, and indeed that is a principal aspect of our work, our charity is called Methoria, and Methoria is the umbrella name for our organisation for all the projects that we have. It means essentially outside the civic space, outside of society. I'm generalising for Greek scholars who can tell me immediately very differently, but in ancient Greece, it was the place beyond the civitas, beyond the border, in effect a liminal space for non-citizens, a contingent place of waiting, exile and expulsion, and a place indeed, as for Sophocles' Antigone, where the dead themselves are denied their rights and their rituals. And we thought that was an apposite name for our work, indeed, because whether we're embarking on work around death and bereavement, or our first rights project, which is about the rights of migrant children, we are dealing with people who are not willingly, in the main, admitted into mainstream societies that they seek to enter or find themselves in, whether that's for protection or other reasons. And as we've seen far too often, they spend many years waiting in a limbo space, legally and physically, and quite alienated from the basic rights that many of us take for granted. So the Last Rights Project is one of two important pillars of our work. It's formed to address the lack of procedure, the lack of accountability, and the lack of respect for those who've died or gone missing on migration journeys, and for their bereaved families and communities. And we do that, as Judith has said, we're lawyers. We're working with other lawyers primarily and other professionals involved in investigating and pursuing the circumstances of migrant deaths, and especially also in the academic world, where most of the thinking, I think, has taken place on these issues a long time before we set up our small organisation. There's a rich source of study which has examined many of the issues that we ourselves are looking at a more activist, grassroots and frontline level. And we couldn't have done our work if it wasn't for a lot of the thinking of academics in this area, not just lawyers, but forensic scientists, anthropologists, and others. And so we also work with migrant community groups, refugee groups, and family associations to promote fundamental human rights standards and to try to establish best practice and standards at a local, national, state, non-state, and international level, globally. We work wherever there's a need, that is to say, sadly, anywhere and everywhere, within what are very limited resources for our small charity. We try to engage in a strategic way. We are already spread very thinly, so we aimed what we do. We aim to do in a way that will benefit and have the biggest impact on the most people. So we try to develop strategic legal and policy campaigns and to facilitate the expert work of others who work directly with bereaved families, and to build a more general awareness of rights, not just with those people who assist refugees, migrants and their families, but with refugee and migrant communities and families themselves. In 2018, we convened a working group on the island of Lesbos in Greece to draft a declaration on the rights of bereaved and missing migrants, which has become known as the Mytilini Declaration, and which Catriona will speak about in more detail shortly. The picture you see on the screen is a photograph of what was then the new graveyard on the island of Lesbos. Tragically, the site of many deaths as people have crossed the Aegean Sea between Turkey and one of the nearest of the Greek and therefore European landfalls from across that water. And it was after much conflict, I think politically, that this graveyard was established. Itself, it's an unregulated and unofficial space, even though it was facilitated by the municipality, and it remains in a state of quasi-legality, shall we say. Those graves are, as you can see, freshly dug in 2015, and that in essentially responded to a couple of very major shipwrecks that caused substantial loss of life and led to say, a situation on Lesbos where there simply wasn't capacity either to bury the dead or even to carry out dignified basics in the mortuaries, etc. And it's where we came in a way. We were in Lesbos as volunteers in 2015. And one of the things that went catastrophically wrong during that time was, Catriona will remind me of how many people did lose their lives, but it was dozens of people in one shipwreck, where there simply was no place to store their bodies so that they could be laid to rest with dignity, or to carry out any of the essential pathology and coronial duties to them. And one of the things that Catriona facilitated and indeed made happen was to send an emergency temporary mortuary to the island so that it could be used by the hospital so that people's bodies could be kept in a state of preservation and dignity whilst those forensic aspects of work were carried out. And it was out of a realization involved in that work that there were so many things that were failing, not particularly on Lesbos, but everywhere, that we thought that we really needed to focus more particularly on all the aspects that come together in relation to migrant deaths in terms of law, because we're lawyers, and that, I think that's what we know a little about. And so we convened this group to bring together experts across many disciplines to look at what might be put into the content of a declaration setting out in one place all the standards and rights which we say are owed to the dead and to bereaved families and missing migrants. Catriona will talk about that. As Judith has said, we met our colleagues at the Thanatic Ethics Conference in Oxford in April this year.
Yes, 2022.
It seems a long time ago in some way. We've done so much together since then. And at that time, we spoke about the impact of COVID-19 on migrant communities. And we presented some work that we'd done during the COVID lockdown, where we, unsurprisingly, found that migrant communities were some of the most heavily prejudiced in terms of the impact of not COVID-19 itself, but policy and practice in relation to migrant communities and the discriminatory impact of access to health care, access to many other forms of essential resources during that time, and the impact as well on those communities where a death had occurred within migrant communities was much more complex. Yes, there's the cover for the Everybody Counts.
There? Oh,
there. And so at the Oxford conference, where we met Judith and Yamna, we talked about a whole range of issues concerning funerary rites and cultural practices around the often taboo subject of death. And it was clear that there was no one unifying cross-cultural approach to death, nor any consistent treatment of the deceased. And nor is there any consistent, coordinated legal and procedural approach to death, and especially in relation to the international aspects of death, in terms, for example, of body exhumation and repatriation, the treatment of deceased migrants and their bereaved loved ones. For example, in obtaining visas to attend funerals and inquiries, very basic things that we take for granted. What is clear is that every deceased person in every culture and every legal system has a right to be treated with dignity and with respect, and that the way their passing is acknowledged and recorded and their bodies laid to rest, and for their loved ones and communities to be able to perform the rites and rituals that are most important to them, and the knowledge of the truth of how that person died, wherever that is possible. In the work that we do, whether that's in Europe or in the Americas or in Africa and Australasia, where we have worked in all those places, and in places where we haven't yet been able to work, it's always those who've died in transit on migration journeys with unsettled temporary status or no legal status at all who are the most routinely denied their fundamental rights of dignity, respect, truth, and justice. The right to life, such as it is in international human rights law, is in many ways underpinned by the way we treat death and the deceased, both through society itself and through the states that govern us. Accountability for every individual death is an absolute necessity, whether it's simply a matter of officially recording the name and the facts of a death and providing an identifiable place of burial, or the more complicated task of identifying remains, tracing relatives, establishing the cause of death, preserving evidence in relation to that death, providing a verdict, and establishing culpability and liability, if any. Without such basic mechanisms, life is devalued and society is degraded. Impunity for deaths caused by the acts or the omissions of the state, whether direct or indirect, are more likely to become the norm in the absence of such basic mechanisms. And we've seen such impunity in various contexts, whether that's in war and civil conflict and during totalitarian regimes. But we also see this increasingly now in seemingly normal, democratically functioning civil societies, particularly in relation to people defined as migrants, who are treated in inferior ways to those with citizenship and settled status. It's ever more apparent since the peak of refugee arrivals in Europe in 2015-16, when we were in Lesbos, over 1 million people made that journey through Europe. And we also saw the hardship that people suffered on those journeys. They carried their families on perilous journeys across the sea, across the Mediterranean, and through other global migration corridors. And we saw that border protection has become much more of an increased priority for states at the expense of international refugee protection. It's become the overwhelming objective of some states to defend at all costs their asserted sovereignties against the incursion of outsiders. And in doing so, both political rhetoric and actions have escalated in their hostility towards migrants, to the point of encouraging, deploying, and normalizing violent language and actions, and diminishing human rights and international legal protections, so that they're rendered meaningless, granting impunity to the perpetrators of such violence. Within this violent and violated space, pushbacks, failure to rescue, destruction of life-saving materials, including bottles of water, and I was showing Yumna earlier my t-shirt, I'll show it you again, has got the slogan "No Más Muertes" on it, no more deaths, which is the name of a very courageous organization who work in the Arizona desert, putting out bottles of water on migrant trails, which are particularly life-saving in such hostile conditions. And we were witness to that as we were taken out in those deserts to look at the awful journeys people have to make. And indeed, in that situation, the American border forces spent their time locating these water bottles and bursting them, filling them with noxious substances, and generally deliberately making it much more likely that people will die on those journeys. It's involved also dehumanizing detention conditions. There's a photograph on your slides of a child in detention on the island of Lesbos. There we are. That was meant to be the child protection compound, where children were kept safe, that in fact was a detention center within a detention center at the notorious so-called camp, refugee camp of Moria until it was burnt down. It's accompanied by dysfunctional administration processes, failure to process asylum claims, prosecution and intimidation of rescuers, and the vilification of lawyers. These are now common currency in the weaponry deployed by states and their agents. Just over a year ago, 27 people died on a crossing from France to the UK across the Channel, La Manche, in an overcrowded inflatable boat. 4 people remain missing and just 2 survived. As investigations in France and the UK progress, it now appears from recent reports that people were left to die in UK waters by the UK border forces, who sought to shift responsibility to rescue those who had drowned onto the French authorities. On the Turkish-Greek River Evros border, at least 40 families that we are trying to assist at the moment, with others in Greece, are currently trying to find loved ones who are most likely pushed back across dangerous waters into Turkish territories. Frontex, the EU border agency, has recently been discredited by the exposure of systematic fraud and the facilitation of pushbacks. Whilst Libyan terror regimes are being paid to act as so-called coast guards to prevent people from fleeing the North African shore. As I've said, in Arizona, the unidentified remains of the dead lie in metal containers behind the county medical examiner's facility in Tucson. And the picture you see on the screen there is a lorry. It's full of bones, desiccated in the desert, unidentified, belonging, as our friend and colleague, Professor Newstad from Northern Arizona University, who was on a field trip there a couple of weeks ago to talk to the medical examiner, told us there are 600 sets of deceased border crossers' bones in that container. There's no space for them in the morgue. That may be an improvement, horrific as it looks. And despite those people being unable to be laid to rest by their families or by anybody, there is a system which is at least being attempted to be put in place so that they may, in time, be identified from those bones, with DNA being taken and other post-mortem data collected. Vigilante groups are encouraged and even paid bounties for policing some of our Eastern European land borders. In effect, migrants are being used as pawns and weaponized by one state against another, encouraging then trapping migrants in frozen no man's lands, for example, on the Belarus-Polish border. These individual tragedies are endless, the cumulative tragedies ever increasing. The scale of unaccountable and avoidable deaths is an international scandal. Occasional news stories do little to seize public attention or incur indignation, let alone lead to policy changes positively. On the contrary, it seems that regular deaths are a necessary element of deliberate cruelty, and callous border defence measures are designed to send deterrence messages indifferent to the pain and suffering that they cause. They're also ultimately always ineffective, save for the escalation of anti-migrant hostility that is politically carefully nurtured. And I'm ashamed to say that I think the United Kingdom is a world-beating country at the moment in sending out those messages. And it's no surprise that it has derived many of those cruelty policies directly from the methods that were deployed in Australia on Manus Island, and the deterrence, deliberately cruel deterrence policies to stop people coming to Australia by boats. These tragedies are far from the only ones. I won't even say how many tens of thousands of people have died, because it will be more across the Mediterranean Sea in the last decade alone, in attempting to seek refuge and better lives. Denied entry through legal routes and schemes. The irregular travel industry, through its facilitators and smugglers, is now a global multi-billion euro alternative economy with no regulation, no security, and virtually total impunity, save for the very occasional criminal trial and convictions. Millions of euros are thrown at escalating security measures, but nothing is done to address the underlying causes of mass movement. But that's a different road, and we have to travel that on another occasion. What we're witnessing now is a steady transformation of border management systems into border defense regimes, and the enemy is the migrant. As global climate change accelerates, so too will the need for millions to move for safer, more viable places. We may already be too late to prevent global climate disaster, but the human consequences in terms of forced migration have barely begun. Immigration policies are being built around impunity for migrant deaths. Indeed, the UK has sought to introduce explicit legislation protecting border agencies from prosecution for the deaths of migrants caused in pushback operations. The migrant must be stopped at all costs, it seems, but we must ensure that accountability is returned to the heart of our immigration control systems. That accountability must be based on the enforcement of existing human rights standards. As I said earlier, the Mytilini Declaration in May 2018 is precisely such a tool. And so I'm going to hand over to Catriona at this juncture to talk more about the basis of that declaration, its origins and its content. And then I'll come back afterwards to pick up more on the issues of impunity and also reparations. So thank you so far, Catriona.
Thank you very much, Sid. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you, those of you attending online. It's great to be here. I'll try not to repeat things, and I'll try to, I'm just aware of the time, so I'll try not to take up too much, so that I don't want us to have time for conversation. As we've heard, the movement of people through forced internal displacement and across international borders is part of everyday life and unlikely to reduce. Every year, these global cross-border movements exact a devastating toll on human life, both on land and at sea. The figure from International Organization for Migration, which has a database which it's kept since 2014, is estimated, and it can only be an estimate, 51,536 people have died or gone missing on migratory routes since 2014, and 25,341 just in the Mediterranean. National responses to migrant deaths have been mainly determined, as Sid has said, by tighter border control policies, anti-smuggling, anti-trafficking strategies. But little attention has been paid to the respect owed to the dead, the missing, and the protection of their bereaved family members. The names of most of the dead and the missing are not known. Families haven't been traced. Where bodies have been found, as we've seen, they're piled in makeshift morgues or buried in unmarked graves. Families have no answers to what happened. They don't know whether a relative, parent, spouse, brother, sister, child is alive or dead. international legal norms don't directly address the rights of those who die or go missing at international borders or of their families. And there's an assumption that human rights end with death. Where legal rules addressing the treatment of the dead or the missing exist, they don't directly apply to the particular context of irregular migration and border deaths. And likewise, little attention has been paid to the importance of respecting local communities. And we could take, for example, again, that of Lesbos, where, as Sid mentioned, over 1 million people arrived in a very, very short space of time on a tiny island. There's that side of the issue to consider as well. And human rights courts have recognised the collective experience of pain, the importance of preserving the memory of the dead and the disappeared, and the need for collective healing and reparation have only rarely been acknowledged, and that in very specific contexts. It doesn't necessarily address directly irregular migration. And so our project took form at the start of 2016, born out of the need as we saw it to address a protection gap and help ensure that dead and missing migrants and refugees and their families are treated with respect and that their rights are honoured. And our primary purpose is to create a new framework of respect for the rights and dignity of missing and dead refugees and migrants and their families. And to that end, we produce standards and practical guidelines which are grounded in international law. Sid's mentioned the right to life, obviously that's the key, on the applicable rights and duties and situations of migrant death and loss. We aim to assist states to establish national standards and procedures toward the dead and the missing and their families, to provide guidance and support to civil society and others who work with the dead, to conduct training on the dignified treatment of dead and missing migrants and refugees, and to advocate for the rights of the dead, missing and their bereaved families. We call on states and international institutions to adopt and implement the standards that we have set out in the Mytilini Declaration. It's too small for you to see it there. I hope that the people who are with us online can see better. So I'll just quickly go through the essence of what is there.
It's on your website anyway.
Yes, it is.
Can be found on the website.
Judith. Yeah. It was agreed on the 11th of May, 2018, between Last Rights and a working group of some 55 of us. Amazingly, that we got to agree, but we did. Including lawyers, social workers, forensic experts, academics, civil society, and of course, migrant and refugee communities. People came from around the world and agreed on that final text. The Mytilini Declaration recognises the respect owed to missing and deceased migrants and refugees. It defines state obligations in relation to tracing the missing, recovering, identifying, preserving, and laying to final rest the deceased, and also establishes the rights of surviving families. A key proposal for states is that they should establish independent national mechanisms dedicated to the issue of migrant death and loss, and for ensuring compliance with the standards of the declaration. The aim then is that these would link to international mechanisms so that there was joined up work and joined up thinking. Behind the declaration is a wealth of material that we gleaned from desktop research and from field visits before our meeting on the island of Lesbos, as well as an electronic consultation. And we have a legal statement and commentary, which you can also find on the Last Rights website. And we're very happy to receive any comments on that. And we ask you, if you are in agreement with the content, to please endorse the declaration. There isn't, apart from the Mytilini Declaration, there isn't any overarching best practice framework. And thus the phenomenon of the missing and the dead as a consequence of migrant and refugee flows has been insufficiently examined and understood in terms of the impact that the loss has on many thousands of families, and in terms of effective deployment of valuable resources to address issues in a humane, dignified and appropriate way. We believe that the Mytilini Declaration is a milestone in this direction. And I don't know whether you mentioned that, no, you didn't, the Global Compact On the 19th of December 2018, the UN General Assembly adopted the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. And Objective 8 of that, I think this was the first time from the UN we had mention of saving lives and the establishment of coordinated international efforts on missing migrants. And it asks states to commit to cooperate internationally to save lives and prevent migrant deaths and injuries, and also to further commit to identify those who died or are missing and to facilitate communication with affected families. So to try to bring all these issues into the one document, we then created the Mytilini Declaration, and I'll try to just summarize the main standards. Migrants, including deceased migrants and refugees, have the right not to lose their identities after death. Thus, states have an obligation to search for the missing, search for the deceased, to collect their bodies, to preserve and identify the deceased. Then to investigate the cause and manner of death, to trace, to notify and assist surviving families through the facilitation of entry, to take all necessary measures to place the remains, in a place where the loved ones have access, a known and marked place. And the Mytilini Declaration recognises for the first time the trauma of families affected by death and loss as a result of migrant journeys as a human rights concern, and sets out the first ever overarching set of standards in this overlooked area of human rights abuse. It doesn't, really importantly, is it doesn't create new rights or new obligations. It brings together and codifies in one place, in one document, existing international norms, which by and large are fragmented or perhaps have been overlooked. And the standards set out draw on international human rights law, international humanitarian law, international criminal law, and of course international maritime law. And this was an effort, as I say, that took place over several months. And it's developed a set of clear and above all practical guidelines. That's the other thing to say. Although we've based this in the law and international law, we've really tried to make it practical and concrete in ways that actually can work every day for those trying to support the missing and the dead and their families. And there's no need to have any formal adoption of it because it's already existing law. It may be that some domestic policies or even perhaps primary legislation might need to be changed, but I think not. And then just very, very quickly, oh yes, it's on the website, obviously, and it's in 8 languages. So hopefully there's one there that you read. Just two recent developments since the creation of the declaration in 2018. Last year was the establishment in May 2021 of the Global Alliance for Missing, which is a 10 states so far, only 10, but it's still a good start. And it began in the margins of the 105th anniversary of the Central Tracing Agency of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And it aims to create political influence to improve the protection of separated and missing persons. And it will allow states to share best practice and guidance and to support family members who are searching for their loved ones. Then in September of this year, the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe published a comment: for the rights of the living, for the dignity of the dead, time to end the plight of missing migrants in Europe. And this comment draws attention to the number of migrants who've died, the phenomenon of migrants, and particularly migrant children who go missing after their arrival in Europe. It addresses the challenges of tracing persons with irregular migration status who often are invisible to the authorities, and highlights the positive obligations of states that are set out in the Mytilini Declaration, the duties that they have towards these groups of people, and the importance of affording deceased family members a dignified burial. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Catriona. I'm not going to talk about impunity because I think we open up another lengthy discussion in a very limited amount of time, but I would like to invite Yumna to offer her comments and questions now, and comments from both our listeners online and from yourselves in the room.
Hey, well, thank you. Fast. I mean, we have to.
Wait, we can talk more.
Yeah. The section is ongoing, but thank you so much for this very much awareness raising talk. And so
I just would like to talk about the collaboration we have through Thanatic Ethics and how the network is growing up. Sid, Catriona, and I, we sat or participated in the same panel at the International Conference of Thanatic Ethics in Oxford. And while I was there, I got an email from a master's student in international relations asking for my help if I could find internship for the summer. And I said, oh, here we go. We have the last rites. So 3 master students of international relations from the American College of the Mediterranean in Aix-en-Provence had an internship, a stage during the summer with the last rites. And it all goes to the Thanatic Ethics. And then Sid and Catriona visited us in Aix, and we started a collaboration. And the thing is, the mission of the students was assigned by Sid and Catriona, assigning specific European states for each student to examine whether these European states have policy about the missing, dead, or the remains. And here I turn it to you and I tell you, based on your research and based on your work and based on the declaration since 2015, 2016, do you have any change or any policies that have been adopted by any EU members? And do you work only on the EU, or do you incorporate different countries when we talk about the last rights?
Okay. Thank you, Yumna. And it's been a very rich experience working with Yumna's students and with the college in Aix. And we hope that that's a long-term relationship. No, the answer is we don't restrict our work to the European continent, let alone European issues. And we, as Catriona said, draw heavily on not just the law, but the cultural experience of death in different regions. And so one of the tasks for the Mytilini Declaration really was to synthesize different legal attitudes, different cultural attitudes, different practices, and take the best and form it in a language that related globally. And I think we achieved that. Time will tell. It's open on our website for endorsement by any institution or individual, and there's a growing list of those who have done so. In terms of what we've achieved, like a lot of our work, I think some of it is in things not being made worse rather than being made better. And it's a very slow, very long process. But as Catriona said, we are seeing international NGOs forming their own thinking, and we've relied on their thinking as well. So it's a virtuous circle in that sense. And the collaboration at a global level has been very rich for us, and I hope for others in turn. So it is raising awareness, it is formulating a language around rights, and that's not easy to get some kind of visibility, but we think that's happening. On a concrete level, the Human Rights Commissioner, the Commission of Human Rights in Greece, adopted the Mytilini Declaration and then promulgated it in Greece as one of its own policies, which has the effect of, in effect, incorporating that into state requirements to follow it in Greece. And through Yumna's students and our interns over the summer, one of the things that is in development is working with a network of European funeral directors who seem to be very much at the heart of a lot of the issues that we have been exploring, because they are the people who hold the hands of bereaved families and indeed the dead themselves, and so are very much in tune with practical and emotional considerations for our work.
Okay, so I sent a message to everyone. I mean, if people want to participate, I mean, don't hesitate to raise your hands or put your question in the chat. So in fact, what becomes even more apparent this time is the extremely strong link between the dead and the living, and denying justice to the dead is, of course, the best way possible to deny justice to the living. So this is something that has come, very forcefully in all the workshops and webinars and the conferences that have been organized within Thanatic Ethics. So this is why, I always say that it's the best way to speak. It's a detour, but it's the best way to speak of the living and to care for justice, in fact, for the living. I would like to know a little bit more about the way you have worked with other actors and other, practitioners. I mean, you mentioned the fact that you worked with forensic anthropologists, other, associations, organizations, etc. So how has this been, going on? If you hadn't been, of course, if you hadn't been lawyers, I mean, it's a very silly and naive question, if you hadn't been lawyers, what kind of other implication, would you have done? I mean, what has being a lawyer, what has it changed in your practice and in the way you have been relating to and with, forensic anthropologists and other associations?
Would you like to answer that, Catriona? Or some of it?
I think it's definitely made us. It's made the dry law come alive in a very particular way. That I used to do work on inquests, so I did have some already, experience of people searching for their dead loved ones or wanting to have answers to questions about how a death had come about. But I think this is far more immediate, far more. It sounds contradictory, doesn't it? To say it's far more alive.
Yes, no, it's not at all contradictory.
And I think it's been good to have discussions with the International Committee of the Red Cross, the National Red Cross and Red Crescent organisations, the International Organisation of Migration, big organisations, and us very small, saying, excuse me, I think you ought to look at this huge issue that is only going to, and sadly has, come very much more to the fore. So there's that. And then another thing that we've done that's been quite different for us is to participate in a communication to the special procedures of the United Nations Human Rights Council regarding the Israeli occupying forces policy of withholding the bodies of deceased Palestinians from their loved ones. And that policy had been found lawful, extraordinarily to our mind. But yeah, we've helped with a change to that, which is continuing. So yeah, the law has, and then yeah, searching for people who've been removed from their graves. It's come to the fore in ways that we wouldn't have imagined. I think it's fair to say.
I think I could also add that when we went to Lesbos in 2015, we didn't go as lawyers, quite the opposite. And when I was introduced as a non-practising lawyer, that was the moment in 2015 thereabouts where I stopped directly representing people with an office in London. So I can no longer describe myself as a practicing lawyer for those purposes with my own clients. And we went to do something different. And we thought we were going to volunteer on Lesbos. Indeed, we were. Catriona went to teach primary age children in the camps, and I went to cook. And it became really apparent that lawyers at that point were useless. And we may have egos as lawyers, but it was a very salutary reminder of the limitations of law, and that the agency of people fleeing hostile regimes and war and seeking sanctuary knew better than we did as lawyers. And people took their lives in their own hands and did what they felt was best for them and their families. And by and large, they were proved right. And we, despite offering legal advice, were really very wrong in that situation. And I think that helped us tremendously as lawyers to say, this really isn't about law. This is about people's experiences and how we interpret that by the law and the legal language that we write.
Thank you. I'm sure there would be questions, comments. I can stop the screen sharing probably. Nada has put in a question. It was a pleasure to see most of my quote unquote Oxford panel. Thank you, Nada. Thank you for this very interesting talk. It's always a pleasure to share those moments offered by Thanatic Ethics. Hope to see and hear you all soon. I have to leave, so it was mostly, saying hello and goodbye. I would also have another question, but I don't want to. No? Yes.
Yeah, so thank you again. I'm going to join my colleagues to thank you for this talk. So in line with, I'll continue the conversation, your expertise in the legal system. You've mentioned earlier that you put together all the existing laws with regards to the immigrants, and there are lots of information about how the legal system really treats the immigrants when they are dead. So I was a bit curious if you had the power to control these laws, what would you really change at first? What do you think that if there are really laws that should be immediately changed, or what can you add, or can you share already with us some of the laws?
Before you answer, just to add to that question, what is missing in international law when it comes to missing migrants?
We think there is nothing missing. And the purpose of this declaration was to show that it is all there. It's the absence of state motivation to use it and to apply it and to hold themselves to account that is really one of the principal problems. And we seem to be fighting a rearguard action month in, year out, in really only defending the things that states willingly signed up to within the last half century, with the latter half of the 20th century. They weren't forced onto the international community. They were seized willingly after the Second World War. And so we're defending something that states themselves felt were progressive international solutions to prevent war, to provide all the fundamental human rights that were denied vast populations of people in that, the genocides that took place. So no, we don't think there's anything missing. There's always a positive interpretation and a progressive interpretation of rights. We didn't come on to talk about the Convention on the Rights of the Child and how that should itself be used as a model to interpret and implement other human rights norms. We didn't have time to talk about impunity, and although we did talk about impunity, we didn't have time to talk about reparations, but it's the accountability mechanisms, I think, that are very, very weak. So we know that it may take years or never come to fruition to hold perpetrators to account. We know that it may take a generation of activist groups like the Mothers of the Disappeared in Argentina and the mothers in the migrant caravan in Tunisia, years and years to establish what happened to their loved ones, by which time politicians have moved on, have died, have denied it, the evidence has gone. So I think if there is an answer to that question, is we have to really strengthen the accountability mechanisms. The standards are all there. The implementation of them is totally undermined by states knowing ultimately they can get away with it.
I think that's right. We've got at the beginning of the Mytilini Declaration as a sort of, well, as a preamble recognising the right to life and the principle of equality. And we then say, we call on states in accordance with their existing obligations to, one, provide safe passage. So for those who are seeking safety, desist from actions that may lead to refoulement, which is sending someone back to a place where they'll be persecuted. Strengthen protocols for search and rescue. Search and rescue laws are already there for all migrants, including those who are missing, and cooperate with and not obstruct or prosecute victims, families, family associations, and civil society in the legitimate exercise of humanitarian search and rescue. And sadly, since 2015, those issues have only come to the fore and got worse. So I think yes, if we're going to distill it, it's more accountability is what we need. The framework is there.
And I think there's a lot that we can learn from the experiences of campaigns in other areas of international law. So in terms of disappearances and the reparations that have been owed and acknowledged particularly in Latin America, these are directly translatable into the things that we should be demanding for migrant deaths. Tens of thousands of deaths of migrants ascribed to being accidents, which are plainly not accidents, which turn into a cumulative atrocity. We've seen on Lesbos and other places memorials and an attempt to memorialize migrant deaths. And we've also seen that those memorials have been destroyed, repeatedly destroyed in some places. And I think we have a lot to learn about how we interpret reparations in this context and the extent and scope of what reparations might include, which is to protect memorials, which is to create institutional memory to prevent these kinds of policies becoming normalized and accepted, and to continue to make those kind of egregious crimes so reprehensible that state actors will think twice before they embark upon them. As I said at the beginning, sadly, those have become extremely normalized.
Yes, Jean-Michel?
Yes, thanks a lot for this presentation. About those accountability mechanisms, I suppose, okay, You mean that it is the powers that be that don't feel accountable, or is it the general public, or is it both? That's the first question. And then the second part of the question would be, in which way, or to what proportion do you think denial, okay, is present in there? Okay, I mean, is it a voluntary denial? Is it something involuntary, means of protecting oneself, whatever? So, and what type of leverage does it leave us to work with, okay, to modify those accountability mechanisms?
I wish I knew the answer.
No.
However, I think you pose some extremely good questions that require really intense examination of state denial for its own action, because we see constantly with the legal work, particularly that takes place in Europe by activist groups, the UK and across Europe, over things like shipwrecks in Italy, the failure to allow disembarkation, deaths in camps, that getting information from the state is absolutely critical. Organizations like academic projects, like the project from Goldsmiths, forensic archaeology, who reconstruct crimes against humanity using new forms of technology, and flush out evidence that states are denying even exists, or say is completely the opposite to what you've seen, what you've witnessed. So yes, we accuse the state, but I think we also have an obligation ourselves as the public not to be so accepting of what we're told. The public is not a homogenous group anyway. It has a vast spectrum of political opinion and views, and we have a very polarized world at the moment where anything is deniable, anything is believable, and we need to get back to, dare I say it, evidence-based politics, rather than just being told what the truth is. And I think therein we've lost a lot of accountability as well. But I don't know the answer. We can carry on doing what we're doing, which is constantly battering away to say, no, that's not the truth. And no, you don't have any evidence to support that. So the deterrence, a lot of these measures are supposedly deterrence based, but they don't deter anything. We need to challenge all these suppositions that immigration policies produce the results politicians say they want.
Yes.
So what I would like to ask is, I understand from your presentation that the purpose of your organization is to incite the states to to identify the dead and the missing. I would like to mention also that last year I attended a seminar about play called Necropolis, which purpose was to raise awareness amongst the European audience. But what I would like to know is, do the immigrants themselves know that they have the right to ask for their rights to find their dead and their missing?
And I would like to mention that Arkady is online as well. So this is, in relation to Necropolis, Arkady is there. So maybe, yes, here it is. So maybe Arkady, you will, say something as well.
You were going to say something, Catriona.
Very much for the question. Very often it's the case that families don't know their rights. So that's an important part of our work is trying to ensure that the rights are disseminated in ways that are accessible to families, ways that they can understand and ways that they can act on. And there are now more organisations, not necessarily legal, but supporting families to know what those rights are. And we're also trying, because there's a dearth, in fact, of lawyers doing this work, unsurprisingly, because it's either not paid or very lowly paid. Trying to create more networks of lawyers who are willing to help in the areas where they can take steps on behalf of families to help them. And education, spreading the word about people's rights is hugely important. So it's very good that you.
I think we tried to sit somewhere midway between families who are the victims in many ways of these policies, and the state and even suprastate organizations like the UN, so that we can act as a conduit between those high up places and, if you like, the front line, so that we can say and act as a voice for families when it comes to policy, when it comes to UN reports. And in fact, before we'd almost even started this project, we were being assisted and recommended by the UN Special Rapporteur on summary executions, who invited us to speak at the General Assembly in New York, the 72nd round, I think it was. And we sat with Mexican families who had lost their loved ones, and we spoke at events there, because the Special Rapporteur wanted to bring us directly into that conversation as people who are trying to enable families to have a voice and understand what their own rights are.
And to exercise them as and when they want to, when they are feeling strong enough to do so.
Yeah.
Arkady, do you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for connecting to the webinar. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Yeah, of course, and of course, I mean, you are clearly in the core of the issues that I've been also trying to put my hands on. So first of all, thank you so much, and it's amazing to hear such an elaborate and clear articulation of what is going on. Just a few comments about the need, the families, and do they have ways to get information? I think we have to remember that a lot of families are also afraid to look for information, and some of them are putting themselves in danger if they are looking for information. They are afraid for the consequences for their loved ones. So there is danger also involved in finding information. I was more interested to hear a little bit more. I mean, about this idea of a memorial, because this is also what I'm kind of thinking about, and perhaps we could also like start a conversation beyond this meeting. But as you mentioned, there were some memorials put in place, and memorials also vandalized. We also saw, for example, how the list of United, which I'm sure you're aware of, was displayed in a biennial in the UK, if I'm not mistaken, and it was also vandalized. So I'm really thinking about which ways of memorials can we think about, which are shareable, which are kind of transgressing also the kind of a clear materiality which can be vandalized. Yeah, it's more of a kind of thinking along how how this task of memory, of dignity can be shared between the different stakeholders. Yeah, there is no question there, but more a call for perhaps joining forces.
Yes, thank you. And I think the conference in Oxford last April really emphasized that we need to work across disciplines, not just those who work with bereaved families, but really across arts, across science, across writing, across every discipline, that we can bring our collective experiences into a place that, as you say, creates something which is more about not so much memorialization, but about preserving the truth. I don't know whether they're one and the same, but one of the things that we are working on has, over a few years now, COVID kind of got in the way, was working with the World Universities and Network and UNESCO to look at ways in which issues of migrant death could be memorialized in a way that UNESCO has a program of intangible assets, I think, as much as buildings and built monuments. But what are the more intangible things that we need to preserve and record and to make public and conspicuous, which might be about writing, it might be about music, it might be about art installation, it might be a repository that Catriona had talked about many years ago of the artifacts that are found on our shores, the very things that we carry around with us. So I have something that is made from a shipwreck and a life jacket. I've got a fake life jacket bag. There are things that draw attention to the issue, which are just daily craft. So that there's such a broad spectrum of things that we can keep the issue conspicuous, and also the bigger issues of memorialization in carving things into rock, if you like. All of these things are necessary. Now we go back to disappearances in America. We were in Guatemala a few years ago, and we were there to talk about migrant deaths, but it was designed to coincide with a festival being put on in Ciudad Antigua, Guatemala, by the community of and families related to Luis de Leon, who was a poet who was tortured and disappeared by the Guatemalan authorities. And in acknowledging that they owed a duty and a responsibility, they agreed that there should be an annual festival, and they agreed that there should be a children's library, and there should be an education program, all to ensure that what happened to those enforced disappearances wouldn't be forgotten. And those are the kind of things that we can talk about and try to get some purchase on in relation to migrant deaths as well.
Thank you. Thomas, do you want to say something?
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. No,
so Thomas
just
Lacroix, one of the co-conveners of Thanatic Ethics project.
Yeah, very good to see you both. I'm sorry not to be with you today. And I got a question. You said that the Mytilini Declaration doesn't create any rights, and that's everything is already there. And what are your sources? What are the text you draw on? Where this right come from?
As a short answer, there's a legal statement and commentary on the Last Rights website where we've set out at some length our thinking about various basic international rights, as I mentioned earlier, starting with the right to life. The right to life contains a huge amount of procedural requirement based on what states ought to be doing, but also there are other rights, the right to respect family life, for example.
I think as an instrument, we go to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we also look at other human rights instruments, refugee law, children's rights law, indeed practice within humanitarian law, which is obviously related to theatres of conflict, but where practice in humanitarian law is a very, very good example of how recording of deaths and the practice around preserving bodies should be followed. So primarily international human rights instruments for the, if you like, black letter law, humanitarian law for a lot of the good practice in managing, recording and preserving bodies of people who have died in the theatres of conflict is readily usable as a source as well, though not of law. So we draw very much from the texts of our international instruments rather than inventing new ones. And we've been deliberately careful not to say that the dead have rights themselves. We could argue it, and indeed we should have discussions about it. And there are those academics who very much would say that there are rights belonging to the dead. But we've stopped short of introducing anything that states haven't already signed up to, in order to say we're not creating anything new. We're simply asking them to honour your existing obligations.
Yeah, we'd be delighted to receive any comments you might have if you have the courage to read the 26 pages that are
all the time in a busy life.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, I mean, it's absolutely devastating, all this. One of the questions I had one of your statements is that I mean, everybody has the right to keep their identity, that you don't lose your identity after death. And one of your jobs is restoring the identity. But hasn't the identity of many of these people already been abolished? For example, what happens when you don't get your refugee status? Then you don't exist anymore. You become invisible in the state. So, I mean, it seems to me that's one of your big challenges. The identity has already been abolished.
Yeah.
And also many migrants, in order not to be caught, they throw their identity cards before.
Oh, I've known some with
invent
5
new
or
ones.
6 identity cards because they had, it depended.
They
You had to show the right identity card to the right authorities in Africa.
And everywhere.
Yeah, well, yes, because I'm sure in Africa.
Yeah, and we have examples now of the state just making up your identity. UK border agency again this week, substituting their view of how old a person is for their own view. Children being denied the very fact of their childhood. So yeah, I don't have
No, there's no, yes.
an answer, but you're right.
An additional challenge.
It's not simply losing your identity when you're dead. The process starts a long, long way behind that. And with the COVID-19 research that we did, the speed with which people's identities went missing, particularly in New York, with the piece that we wrote there, because they were wrongly identified as they were admitted to hospital, then their families couldn't find them because they weren't registered on the system in the names that they were known by, or had always been needing to work in an assumed name because they were not fully part of the official population, meant that when you died, you went completely missing, and you may have ended up in a mass grave on an island off New York because of an administrative, not even an error, but because of administration. So yeah, you're absolutely right. We begin to lose our identities because of the system a long way before they're fundamentally lost forever.
Yes, I think the group of people that we're focusing on are right at the end of the spectrum of those who have been made other or made invisible. And obviously we need to pay attention all the way along that spectrum. Very right to highlight it.
Yes.
And I'm wondering regarding.
If you can speak up, because it's difficult to hear.
I was wondering regarding the duties of a state to honor dead migrants. For instance, in case of people who have specific rights in relation to dying and to being buried, for instance, rights which are beyond being buried, for instance, are being cremated. Is it also a duty of the state to fulfill these specific rights, or do they sometimes have to go for the usual burial in case they do not have any, not any, but enough enough information, for instance, on these rights?
It's a very good question. Thank you for that. Yes, there's a duty to not only ascertain the identity of the person, but also to know something about their background. And that would include whether they had any particular faith. And if they did have a particular faith, what does that faith say about funeral and burial rituals? What does it say about cremation? Is that approved of? Is it not? And what steps should be taken, therefore, to respect those funeral and burial rights? Yes, it's extremely important. Yeah, and we're working on protocols on that.
And also in the form of cremation, if there is no body left at all, how can you preserve a body in order to perhaps later identify them, like the container we saw in Arizona? One of the things that we did a little bit of work on with campaigning organizations in Sri Lanka was around the systematic cremation of populations against the wishes of their communities. That's an issue that is being taken forward with the UN. So there are things that are done in the name of funeral rights which can be, persistently harmful as well, quite deliberately, in order to undermine communities in the living. And also just through neglect as well. It's easier to dispose of bodies. And one of the things that we've talked about is that the temporary nature of being placed in the ground. If you can't afford to stay in the ground, in many communities, your bones are lifted out and eventually you go into a bone pit, unidentifiable from everybody else's. So the preserving of the individual identity of the deceased is extraordinarily important, particularly when the deceased is unknown.
And I think that's why we felt that the truck at the back of the county examiner in Tucson was actually a positive thing, because each little box in there has got the remains of, so far as they know, of one person, and they are trying to preserve them there until they can be identified. So shocking as that may initially seem, it perhaps is a good thing. To come back to the question of the funeral rites and burials, I don't know whether you were here where you saw we had the picture of the graveyard on Lesbos. Did you see that? And that there was a white tent at the back of the photo you might have seen, which was the place where the young Egyptian man who was acting as imam would perform the rituals before the burial of those who are, I think, almost entirely Muslim in that graveyard. So yeah, steps are being taken. It's not ideal, but
We have maybe one last question.
I'll go back to the subject of accountability, because I remember particular violent demonstrations in Athens and people speaking out for these communities, the migrant community, and these demonstrations weren't ignored by the government, but silenced with police violence. And I'm wondering if legal reminders and demonstrations aren't enough to put pressure on the states. Are there any way to maybe put pressure or accountability for people who are directly working at the borders? I mean, maybe taking them accountable for their violence within the camps as individuals, or is it strictly not in fact, but the pressure put on the state?
I think we do need to be active in demonstrating. I'm a great believer in the power of protest, and I think so are states, which is why they become so heavy-handed in repressing protest. And if you've been to South America, particularly, you will see just how effective some protests can be in affecting change, I think, or at least attempting to. 2019 in Chile, if you get the chance to see, it's on release at the moment, My Imaginary Country, is very forcible reminder of how effective solidarity is. But one of the things that we do need really is, and I think it's recognized by special rapporteurs, perhaps within the UN institutions, that who are now working much more closely together to make some of these issues more accountable, is working. So there's a UN special rapporteur on human rights defenders. Mm-hmm. There's a UN special rapporteur on summary and arbitrary killings and executions. There's a human rights rapporteur in lots of different aspects of civic society. And they've been working together to make reports and to propel these into UN discussions. Now, the mechanisms of accountability are weak, but we certainly noticed when the UN rapporteur on arbitrary killing spoke not about migrants, but about some of the practices in the Philippines, it was received in acute embarrassment. And you say, well, so what, acute embarrassment? But she really exposed the discomfort of UN members in what she determined to say in her annual report. So we also call upon the UN itself to include in periodic reports questions of states, holding them to account on migrant deaths, for example. Then lots of questions that need to be asked about deaths of migrants don't even feature in states' annual human rights or periodic human rights reporting. They should. The Global Compact that Catriona mentioned, it's got no teeth. It's a great document. It's one, again, states signed up to very recently. I have to say willingly. But those kind of things can be turned into concrete instruments if they're used in a way that actually forces states to answer them. If they don't, they don't, but then we're left with our own protest.
20 seconds, closing remarks. just taking into consideration the status quo of states are not held accountable, families are not familiar with the laws, the sensibility of the topic, the public unawareness, I would like to emphasize the role of visual arts and visibility in order to spread this. Visual arts, whole performance and films and memorial, and also the visibility maybe by using the web and social media for spreading the word or spreading awareness. So in all of this, the importance of visual arts and visibility. And the last point is that the living need the dead more than the dead need the living. And that's why maybe your laws are based on laws of human rights, the rights of the living, not of the dead. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And I've put also the website of Arcadisides in the chat, but it's easy to find, you know, Arcadisides. So even in this small audience, I mean, you've got a couple of people who actually were at Necropolis. So, and I was there as well. And so thank you, Yumnat, for these closing remarks. Absolutely right. And thank you again. Thank you to all.
Thank you.
Thanks.